In 2011, if you walked into a Verizon store in the United States, you did not ask for an iPhone. You asked for an HTC. For a brief shining moment, HTC was the coolest smartphone company on earth. They were selling more phones in the US than Samsung. They were selling more phones than Apple. Their stock price had risen 1,000% in 2 years. They were named the Device Manufacturer of the Year at the Mobile World Congress. They had a market cap of $37 billion. Their slogan was quietly brilliant. And they were brilliant. They built the first Android phone. They built the first 4G phone. They built the first unibody metal phone. They were the architects of the modern smartphone era. But today, HTC is a ghost. Their market share is 0.0%. Their stock has lost 95% of its value. Most teenagers today have never even heard of them. They went from being the king of Android to a cautionary tale about the brutal economics of hardware. How did a company that did everything right lose everything so quickly? They had the best design. They had the first mover advantage. They had the partnership with Google, but they forgot the one rule of the smartphone war. Being first is not enough. You have to be defensible. This is the story of how HTC got squeezed to death by Apple on the high end and Samsung on the low end. HTC stands for High-Tech Computer Corporation. It was founded in 1997 in Taiwan. But this was not a garage startup story. The founder Cher Wang was born into royalty. Her father was Wang Yongqing, one of the richest men in Taiwan. He was known as the god of management. He founded Formosa Plastics. Cher Wang had money, but she wanted to build something of her own. She teamed up with Peter Hsu, a brilliant but erratic engineer. Peter Hsu was a perfectionist. He would inspect prototypes with a magnifying glass. If a button was off by a millimeter, he would throw it across the room. Together they built a business model that was very boring but very profitable. They were an ODM, original design manufacturer. This means they built devices for other companies. If you bought a Compaq IPAQ in 2000, it was actually built by HTC. If you bought a Palm Trio later on, it was likely built by HTC. They were the invisible hands behind the mobile revolution. They were the best engineers in the world, but nobody knew their name. They were content being the factory behind the curtain. But in 2006, Peter Hsu made a dangerous decision. He wanted the glory. He decided that HTC should stop making phones for other people and start making phones for themselves. He wanted to put the letters HTC on the back of the device. It was a massive risk. It meant competing with their own customers. Microsoft was angry. Palm was angry. But Peter Hsu saw the future. He saw that the smartphone was about to eat the world. In 2007, the iPhone launched. Every phone manufacturer in the world panicked. BlackBerry panicked. Nokia panicked. But HTC saw an opportunity. Google was secretly building an operating system to compete with the iPhone. It was called Android. Google needed a partner to build the hardware. They went to Samsung. Samsung said no. They went to LG. LG said no. They went to Motorola. Motorola said no. They were all too proud. They had their own operating systems. But HTC was hungry. They said yes. On September 23, 2008, HTC released the HTC Dream, also known as the T-Mobile G1. It was the very first Android phone in history. It was ugly. It had a weird chin that stuck out at the bottom. It had a slide-out keyboard. It looked like a brick compared to the sleek iPhone. But it worked. It had the Google Play Store, then called the Android market. It had Google Maps. It was the start of a revolution, because HTC was the first partner that got special treatment from Google. For the next 3 years, HTC and Android were synonymous. If you wanted an Android phone, you bought an HTC. They released the Nexus 1 for Google. They released the HTC Hero. They released the HTC Evo 4G, which was the first phone capable of 4G speeds. Reviewers loved them. They had a custom software skin called HTC Sense. It added a beautiful clock widget with windshield wiper, weather animation. It felt premium. It felt personal. While Samsung was making cheap plastic phones that felt like toys, HTC was making devices out of aluminum and magnesium. By 2011, they were on top of the world. Cher Wang was the richest person in Taiwan. Peter Hsu was hailed as the Steve Jobs of the East. But the wolves were circling. Steve Jobs hated Android. He called it a stolen product. He famously told his biographer, "I will spend my last dying breath and every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to destroy Android. I am going to destroy Android because it is a stolen product. I am willing to go to thermonuclear war on this." But Steve Jobs could not sue Google. Google gave Android away for free. So Steve Jobs sued the manufacturers. And because HTC was the leader, he targeted them first. In 2010, Apple sued HTC for infringing on 20 patents. It was a brutal legal battle. Apple argued that HTC stole the concept of sliding to unlock. They stole the concept of tapping a phone number to call it. They stole the pinch to zoom gesture. HTC was a relatively small company compared to Apple. They did not have an army of lawyers. They did not have a war chest of cash. The lawsuit distracted them. Executives spent months in courtrooms instead of design labs. In December 2011, the U.S. International Trade Commission ruled against HTC. They issued an import ban on some HTC phones. Millions of HTC devices were stuck at customs. They could not enter the United States. It was a logistical nightmare. This was the first crack in the dam. Carriers like Verizon and AT&T started to get nervous. They did not want to sell a phone that might get banned next week, so they started looking for a safer alternative. And there was one company waiting in the wings, a company with deep pockets and its own factories. Samsung? The year 2012 is when the dream died. This is where the middle squeeze happened. On the high end you had Apple. They owned the premium market. They had the ecosystem with iMessage and the App Store. Once you bought an iPhone you never left. On the low end you had the new Chinese brands, Xiaomi, Huawei, and Oppo. They were building phones that were 90% as good as HTC, but sold for half the price. HTC was stuck in the middle. They were trying to sell premium Android phones. But then Samsung arrived with the Galaxy S3. Samsung did not have better taste than HTC. Their phones were plastic and felt cheap, but Samsung had two things HTC did not have: vertical integration and a marketing budget. Vertical integration means Samsung made its own parts. They made their own screens, they made their own chips, they made their own memory. This meant they could build a phone cheaper than HTC. HTC had to buy screens from Samsung. They had to buy chips from Qualcomm. When supply was tight, Samsung would keep the best screens for themselves and sell the older ones to HTC. HTC was fighting a war against its own supplier. But the real killer was marketing. In 2012, Samsung spent $10 billion on marketing. They launched the famous "The Next Big Thing Is Already Here" campaign. It mocked Apple users waiting in line. It was everywhere. Super Bowl commercials, billboards in Times Square, TV spots during the Olympics. HTC could not compete. Their marketing budget was a fraction of Samsung's. Their slogan, "Quietly Brilliant," was the problem. They were too quiet. Nobody knew why the HTC One was better than the Galaxy S3. They just saw the Samsung ads and bought the Galaxy. HTC realized they had a marketing problem, so in 2013 they decided to go big. They hired Robert Downey Jr., he was Iron Man. He was the biggest movie star in the world. They paid him $12 million for a 2-year contract. They launched a $1 billion ad campaign called Change. The commercials were bizarre. They featured Robert Downey Jr. saying random phrases that started with HTC humongous tinfoil catamaran, hipster troll car wash. Hold this cat. The audience was confused. The ads did not show the phone. They did not show the features. They did not explain why you should buy an HTC. They just showed Iron Man being weird. It was a colossal waste of money. While Samsung was showing people cool features like sharing photos by tapping phones together, HTC was showing a hipster washing a car with a troll. Sales continued to plummet. Desperate for a hit, HTC tried a Hail Mary. They partnered with Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg wanted to control the mobile experience. So HTC built the HTC first. It was launched in April 2013. It was the first phone with Facebook Home pre-installed. Instead of a normal home screen, your phone was just a feed of Facebook photos. You could not see your apps easily. You could not use widgets. It was annoying. It turns out people like Facebook, but they do not want to live inside Facebook 24 hours a day. The phone was a disaster. It launched on AT&T for $99. 1 month later, AT&T dropped the price to 99 cents. Even at 99 cents, nobody bought it. They eventually canceled the phone and stopped selling it entirely. It was another humiliation. It showed that HTC had lost its identity. They were just throwing spaghetti at the wall hoping something would stick. There is one other tragic chapter in the HTC story. The story of Beats by Dre. In 2011, HTC made a smart move. They bought 50.1% of Beats Electronics for $300 million. At the time, Beats was just a headphone company. HTC wanted to put Beats audio software in their phones to make them sound better. It gave them a cool factor. HTC phones came with expensive Beats headphones in the box. It was a differentiator. But as HTC started running out of cash in 2012, they needed money. So they sold half of their stake back to the Beats founders Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine. Then in 2013, they sold the remaining 25% back. HTC made a small profit on the sale. They thought they were smart. 1 year later, in 2014, Apple bought Beats for $3 billion. If HTC had just held on to their shares, they would have made billions. Instead, they sold their golden ticket right before it hit the jackpot. It was a perfect metaphor for the company. They saw the future first, but they could not hold on to it. By 2016, HTC was bleeding cash. Their stock was trading at levels lower than the cash they had in the bank. Basically, the market was saying the business was worth less than zero. They had one last asset, their engineering team, the people who actually built the phones. In 2017, Google came back to the table. Google wanted to build its own phone called the Pixel. They needed engineers, so they bought the core engineering team from HTC for $1.1 billion. 2,000 HTC employees became Google employees overnight. It was a hollow victory. HTC had basically sold its brain. The company that built the first Android phone had been cannibalized by the creator of Android. With the money from Google, HTC decided to pivot again. They went all in on virtual reality. They launched the HTC Vive. It was a great headset. Critics loved it. But VR is a tiny market compared to smartphones. And just like with phones, they faced a giant competitor with infinite money. Facebook, now called Meta bought Oculus and subsidized the headsets, selling them at a loss. HTC could not afford to sell at a loss, so the HTC Vive remains a niche product for high-end gamers, while Meta owns the mass market. Today, HTC still exists, but you have to squint to see them. They release 1 or 2 mid-range phones a year, mostly in Taiwan. They focus on blockchain phones and crypto wallets. They are a zombie company. They float along on the revenue from their old patents and their VR headsets. But the days of quietly brilliant are gone. They are just quiet. The fall of HTC is a masterclass in the brutality of the hardware business. Here are the 3 lessons from their collapse. Lesson 1 being first is not a moat. HTC was first to Android, first to 4G, first to metal designs. But technology becomes a commodity very quickly. Within 6 months, Samsung and LG had copied everything HTC did. If your only advantage is we did it first, you will lose. You need a moat. A moat is a sticky ecosystem like Apple, or a vertical supply chain like Samsung, or a massive price advantage like Xiaomi. HTC had none of these. They just had good engineers. Lesson 2, the middle is the kill zone. In consumer electronics, you want to be at the top or the bottom. At the top you have high margins and brand loyalty like Apple. At the bottom you have volume and mass adoption like Xiaomi. HTC was stuck in the middle. They were too expensive for the budget shoppers, and they were not premium enough for the luxury shoppers. When the market matures, the middle gets squeezed out. This is happening right now to companies like Sony and Asus. Lesson 3, marketing is part of the product. Engineers hate to hear this. Peter Xu believed that if he built the best phone, people would buy it. He was wrong. The best product does not always win. The best-known product wins. Samsung proved that a mediocre phone with $1 billion ad budget will beat a great phone with no ad budget. HTC was quietly brilliant. But in the smartphone war, you need to be loudly brilliant. HTC built the foundation of the Android world. They were the architects. But once the building was finished, the tenants moved in and kicked them out. They were the first to rise and the first to fall.